First of all, I want it duly noted that I've been making videos in my kitchen long before it was cool. Secondly, we're going to spend today talking about one particular issue between Burke and Bernstein. That is the issue of the common man, the so-called common man. But before I get to that, I just want to spend a minute on this issue of what conservatism means, and actually the confusion, especially in the United States, regarding what it and socialism mean. I mean, part of the reason why we have such a hard time communicating is because these terms mean so many things to different people, and they've morphed over time. So what Burke is a classical conservative. And I think that if you've listened to the previous two videos, you know that's a way different beastie than, say, a contemporary neoliberal conservative, like a Reagan-Thatcher type conservative. And a Trump type conservative is something else, more like a nationalist type conservative. Really, there is no common core in that term anymore. The term conservative, as it is used in the United States, is so amorphous that it's almost meaningless. And certainly when we're dealing with Burke, he exemplifies the original meaning of the term. In the United States also, socialism has become, well, it's definitely a bad word in a lot of people's minds. And it can mean anything from the big welfare state, you know, oh my gosh, taxes are being raised, it's socialism, to, you know, redistribution or more redistribution, to some nationalization of economic sectors, but it doesn't usually ever get to what Edward Bernstein was advocating, which is a much more thoroughgoing democratic socialism in which the workers basically own the means of production, use it to their benefit, and so forth. Okay, so I just want to make that clear that in this country, probably half the battle is simply knowing what you're talking about when you use those two terms, and it's very difficult. But what I wanted to get to today was this issue that's raised by both of these authors of the common man, the problem of the common man. For Marxists, sometimes this is expressed as the problem of the revolutionary subject. Who is it who is going to bring about the change? For a lot of Marxists, it's working class people, especially the classic model of the working class revolution. But we already know that Edward Bernstein does not want a revolution. He doesn't think that a revolution would benefit most people because it would be taken over by demagogues, and that it would be a catastrophe. And he places his hope in democratic reforms, okay? But I want to zero in on what he thinks of the common person at his time. He basically says near the end, actually the conclusion of the book is really choice. Like if you didn't read anything else, you should read the conclusion, because it gives you an idea of what he really thought about working class people. He says at the moment they are not the automatic paragon of virtue that, say, some of his Marxist colleagues thought they were or acted like they were. He points out that in his view they have a lot of vices, that they're more plagued by vices that kind of keep them down and keep them from being able to work effectively to, you know, combine their efforts into a movement. He actually notes that they drink too much, and they have other vices, maybe gambling would be one, I don't know, that prevent them from concentrating on social improvement. And he basically thinks that this is going to stand in the way, or it stands in the way right now, so that if you gave them, or well, if they gave themselves power, they wouldn't be able to handle the responsibility. Well, that's saying a lot. You know, it's a sort of like pejorative or insulting view of the working class, or at least certainly could be taken that way. And yet we know that Bernstein wants ultimately for the working class to gain its power and to take control of its own destiny. So the problem for Bernstein is that they're here, you know, in this kind of morass, which is partly, and this is what makes him different, it's partly their problem, okay? And it's partly a problem caused by the circumstances that they're in, and the two are synergistic, they go together. So he says that we cannot demand from a class, the great majority of whose members live under crowded conditions, are badly educated, and have an uncertain and insufficient income, the high intellectual and moral standard which the organization and existence of a socialist community presupposes. Here he's saying that to have a good socialist community, I guess where everybody's truly equal and everybody treats each other with respect, you've got to have a certain amount of education that's pretty predominant in that society. You have to have a certain amount of agreement about how people will treat each other and what the aims are. And because of these conditions, right, of the working class, they're not ready. Again, badly educated, uncertain and insufficient income, leaving them very unstable, which is a condition that tends to lead to the so-called vices of drinking, gambling, and so on and so forth. Okay? So they're not ready for socialism, but this is generally not because of some inherent flaw. That's not to say that they can't work on their flaws or shouldn't, because Bernstein clearly thinks they should, and that they should be urged to do so by let's say, socialist union organizers. But that doesn't mean that there's some sort of inherent and eternal flaw that can't be corrected, right? So for Bernstein, it's a problem that can be overcome, but it's a problem that is not permanent, but it's a problem that has to be overcome before they can move on much further. Okay, he actually says to the to his fellow Marxists who disagree with him that they need to realize that this little plant has grown on another soil than theirs, and that it continues to grow. In other words, that it's not ready for revolution, but these democratic reforms that the democratic socialists are pushing could lead someday to their being ready. That is a different position than Edmund Burke. And so here we get to see a pretty core difference between the two, and we get to see what a classical conservative view of the so-called common man is. Burke is way more skeptical about the long-term promise of the common man, and he includes in the common man category people that Bernstein probably wouldn't. He goes on and on in the Reflections on the Revolution in France about these small town professionals, we might call them, okay? The small town, lawyer, businessman, merchant, even small town clerics and clerks, okay? Doctors. These people, not to mention the people beneath them in the small town, are lumped into what Burke would see as the common man. And Burke's attitude towards this group of people is really rather dismal and hopeless. Okay, so he says, woe to that country that, passing into the opposite extreme, which he's referring there to revolutionary egalitarianism, considers a low education, a mean contracted view of things, a sordid mercenary occupation as preferable title to command. Everything ought to be open, but not indifferently to every man, okay? I just want to dwell on the content of this for just a little bit here. A low education, okay, we know what that means, right? People who have no education, or they have kind of a second-rate education, right? A mean contracted view of things, all right, results from this, the milieu that they're in his view. Their education means that they are, a mean contracted view basically means that they are narrow-minded, okay, that they can't see very far, they don't have much vision of things. And he says also a sordid mercenary occupation as preferable title to command, a sordid mercenary occupation. Burke looked down at people who were just about making money. Okay, that's one of the differences between the classical conservative and the neoliberal conservative. Okay, Burke thought that the sort of dogged pursuit of nothing but money was basically mediocre. So Burke sees people as falling in a natural spectrum in a way that Bernstein doesn't. For Bernstein, most of it is a matter of their context and also, to a certain extent, their willpower. But for Burke, there is a natural spectrum of people. He says in all societies consisting of various descriptions of citizens, some of them, that is, some descriptions of persons, must be uppermost. The levelers, that is, the people who want to make everybody equal, therefore only change and pervert the natural order of things. They load the edifice of society by setting up in the air what the solidity of the structure requires to be on the ground. Okay, so basically there he's saying that you have to have that solid foundation of people who actually know what they're doing and have a stake sufficient in society in order to do the right thing. And if you try to level everybody, you upset that foundation. Burke thought that common citizens could and should be elevated to the point of participation somehow in the process through voting for representatives, for instance. But they should not be allowed to rule. In other words, they should never be allowed to be those who make the decisions, to become the majority of the decision makers. This leads to a difference to note between the two. Bernstein embraces Enlightenment hope for the eventual development of the working class. So his position is similar to John Stuart Mill on the common people, and also Mill wrote a book on women in the same regard, right? The idea that we don't know for sure what their potential is, but we're pretty sure that most of the reason why they've been kept down at a lower level of achievement is because of the circumstances that they're in, the environment that they've been placed in, the oppression that they've experienced, and so on. Okay, that seems to be Bernstein's view of the working class. And so what that means is that he has every hope that the common people, under the right conditions, can rule and can be quite effective. Burke is way more skeptical of the Enlightenment claim of natural equality in all respects. Okay, he does say that human beings are equal as, say, human beings, that everybody ought to be respected, have a certain dignity that is respected. But you can't expect the same type of performance out of different people. So Burke was a Whig, he believed in a balanced form of government. He believed that representation was good, but it had its limits. And this is the way this is the way that he interacts with the Enlightenment values, right? To a certain extent, they're correct, but you've got to see them through the prism of actual society, and there are limits, right? And one limit is this this natural spectrum. That leads me to a final thought concerning the common man, okay? And that is an issue that Bernstein brings up, what I would call itineracy. He calls the roving proletariat. Bernstein thought that one of the things that capitalism was doing for the working class at his time was elevating enough people to the point of getting them out of just subsistence living, that they could actually have the wherewithal, the stability, the interest to create a true, strong union movement. He basically said until people got to a certain point, they'd be too busy trying to survive to organize. Okay, so he says that with a roving proletarian without a family and a home, no lasting firm union movement would be possible. Okay, I found that an interesting statement because immediately I thought, well, we've passed through that stage where Bernstein had hope that the working class would be elevated, right, to the point where they could organize, into a long period in which they did organize, right, followed by a period up until now in which that organization has pretty much fallen apart, and we have a rise of the, quote, roving proletarian again, or the itinerant worker. Okay, it looks different now than it did then. Arguably, the people involved are still living at a higher standard of living than the people back then who were roving proletarians. But this issue of itinerancy is a real one, a real important one. We now use the term precariat to describe working class people who work on contracts, who have multiple jobs but no job security, um, you know, uh, day labor, piece labor, and various things like that, right? We have a lot of people in our country and around the world who are in this category of the precariat, and it does indeed make people very unsusceptible to organization, because they're, first of all, they're literally trying to just get by, just to make enough money to like survive. Secondly, they could lose their jobs at any time. Therefore, the main thing they're going to focus on is just trying to keep them, right? Being way too afraid to try to organize. Thirdly, split up into so many different jobs and occupations, part-time work, multiple part-time jobs. How could they organize? Okay, so whether Bernstein could have possibly imagined that, kind of as we went over the hump of capitalist development into this next stage, whatever you want to call it, the neoliberal stage, managerial corporate capitalism, or the rise of the vectoralist class, according to Mackenzie Ward, that we would have reached a stage where, yet again, the proletariat is roving. So I may do one more on this topic, but then I'll be moving on to a book by Chantelle Mouffe, The Return of the Political. So I'll try to remember to put a link down in the notes below to where you can get this book. It's not very thick. I've been wanting to read this for a while, so looking forward to it.